Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, on behalf of BM Council and Management, good afternoon and a very warm welcome to all of you on the occasion of our 61st Annual General Meeting. Let me also acknowledge the presence of our Council members, partner members, CEOs of organizations, presidents of organizations, past president of BM, members of commissions, heads of commissions, and members working in different working groups. Thank you for joining us this afternoon on this auspicious occasion. Our two previous AGMs were held in a hybrid format due to the pandemic, and we are back to our normal setup. Witnessing the turnout and the variety of people from different horizons and enterprises, we are delighted to note that we are getting the support and interest of our membership. Today's event will be in two parts. Very shortly, we'll be conducting the official business of an AGM. Thereafter, it will be followed by a panel discussion on a theme which is very topical these days, namely rising inflation and its impact on the cost of living. Our panelists will engage in a courageous conversation. We'll be looking at different aspects like impact of inflation on households, on the economy, on businesses, and they will share their viewpoints on workable policy options and choices which are available to policymakers. We have been informed that Mr. Pierre Zinan, one of the panelists, because of health reasons, will be not among us. So hopefully he has made arrangements, and Kevin will be informing us on how he intends to conduct the panel discussion with the two other panelists, who are Dr. Sen Narayanan and Professor Sunil Kumar Bendu of University of Mauritius. So I will now invite Mr. Jean-Pierre Dallet, the President, to officially start the meeting. Thank you.
Good afternoon to everyone. And a warm welcome again to this AGM. So I believe that we are all set to proceed. I understand that the quorum is met and that all official records for the AGM has been duly circulated to the members, and I therefore declare the meeting open. So, the first item on the agenda is the approval of minutes of proceedings of the 60th Annual General Meeting held on Wednesday, 20th October 2021. I propose that unless there are any corrections, that the minutes are considered to be approved. And if I can request a member to please propose, and another one to second, please. So we have one proposal and one secondment. Thank you, well noted. The second item, it is the presentation of our audited accounts for the period that just ended 30th of June, well, a little while ago, 22. And I wanted to invite Mrs. Madhvi Rabning-Clark to present the accounts to us.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. In line with Article 16 of the Business Mauritius Rules, as Treasurer of Business Mauritius, I have ensured, Mr. President, that prior to today's AGM, the following documents are prepared and submitted to the National Council, namely the Statement of Financial Position as at 30th June 2022, the Statement of Receipts and Payments, and the Statement of Income and Expenditure for the last accounting period, which is July 2021 to June 2022. In accordance with the rules of the Register of Associations, Mr. President, these documents need to be considered and approved at today's annual meeting. We shall then move for the estimates of income and expenditure for the current accounting period to be approved. So, Mr. President, BM Council members, the CEO, COO of Business Mauritius, management of Business Mauritius, and of course, dear members, good afternoon. It is my utmost pleasure today to present to you a summary of the financial statements of Business Mauritius for year ended 30th June 2022. I will briefly go over the following. For the accounting period 2021-2022, the statement of financial position, the statement of receipts and payments, and income and expenditure statement. Our accounts were audited by Charteris, and I seize this opportunity to thank the auditors for their work and very positive collaboration with the management of Business Mauritius. I would like to start by summarizing the financial situation at Business Mauritius. As you will see from the figures, Business Mauritius has a healthy balance sheet. At 30th June 2022, the total assets, mainly made up of property, cash and debtors, and the total accumulated funds and liabilities were of 104,828,130. The cash balance at 30th June 2022 was of 32,333,357. As you will now see on the statement of receipts and payment, the opening cash and bank balance was at 33,149,842, and the closing balance was at 44,020,081. These amounts include project monies that Business Mauritius manages, such as the AFDs. As per the statement of income and expenditure, we ended the year with a surplus of 223,447 and with a total of comprehensive income of nearly 2.9 million. Would there be any questions before we move the statement of receipts and payments for year ended 30th June for approval? Mr. President, there doesn't seem to be any question.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Madvi, for this clear presentation. So there's no questions. I therefore propose that the budget be approved. If I can have someone actually to officially propose. Thank you.
Is proposing.
And second. Jacqueline is second. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, so we will now proceed with the appointment of the auditors.
Sorry, Mr. President, I will just quickly move on to the approval of the estimates
the
first.
budget first, sorry.
Thank you.
Okay.
I am now pleased to present to you for approval for the current year, for the current accounting period, estimates of income and expenditure and capital expenditure budget. We foresee an income of 46,265,000 and expenditure of 45,368,386. After taking into consideration the finance costs, the finance income and tax expenses, a surplus of 1,446,614 is foreseen on operations for the coming year, which is higher than the surplus made last year. And this is mainly explained by an expected increase in member subscription income as well as income generated by training activities. The capital expenditure is budgeted at a total of 3,285,000. This amount is forecasted to be higher this year, as you will see on the slide, as Business Mauritius will carry out renovation works, purchase IT equipment, and acquire a new software in view of digitalizing the filing and archiving systems. Can I take any questions before we move for approval?
No questions on the budget? If that is so, if I can move to get the budget approved. Anyone would like to propose? Thank you, Jacqueline. And someone to second, please. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Good. If we can, therefore, now move to the fourth item, which is the appointment of the auditors for the year ending June 2023. I understand that our current auditors, Camp Charteris, have expressed their interest to remain as auditors for this current financial year. And I would like to therefore propose to keep Camp Charteris as the auditors of the association. If that is okay with you, I would like please to have someone to propose. Thank you. And someone to second, please. Fabien. Good. So thank you again, Madvi. And we'll move on to the next item.
The past 12 months have been very eventful for Business Mauritius. We have been engaged in several projects, activities, working with different stakeholders. So we have now the pleasure to invite our president to present his report and deliver his address. Thank you.
Now it's my turn to take the floor and speak about the past year. First of all, I would like to say that it gives me great pleasure to address you today after a year at the presidency of Business Mauritius. At the time of our last AGM, we were all encouraged by the recent reopenings of our borders after an intense period of economic suffering. The future bookings in the hotel industry were extremely encouraging, and we were set up for a strong launch indeed. Although 2022 taught us a hard lesson, we were far from imagining the impact of Omicron and our sudden listing on the French Red Scarlet list. Instantly, we were back in fighting mode, and I must say that within 1 week, we were off that list. The blow was hard, but we limited the damages by all working together. I would like to use this opportunity to thank all of those who work relentlessly at changing the mind of the French government. As expressed at Parliament, I quote, "a testimony of the power of public-private partnership when harnessed in a spirit of patriotism." You will agree that such collaboration should be more often on the cards. Easier said than done. Strengthening the collaboration between the government and the business sector has come with its own challenges. Indeed, it does take two to tango. The COVID crisis, the worst that I believe any of us have experienced, mobilized a new energy as we felt threatened like never before. It harnessed the collaboration within the private sector, but we ought to be proud of. I would like to extend my special thanks to the past chairman, Vidya, and to the chairs of the committees that were set up at the time. And if I may, on behalf of all of us, thank our CEO, Kevin, and the whole of the Business Mauritius team for the tremendous work accomplished during that time. I believe that you all deserve an applause. To name a few of the actions then taken: contribution to the work access permits, support to the national vaccination program, facilitation for distribution of food packs to vulnerable families, a change of regulation or convincing towards a change of regulation leading to easier access to food whilst reducing wastage, ensuring that the maximum projects got accredited under the Sunreef program, providing support on the many revised HR policies, making sure we were heard clearly in the preparation of a national budget, and of course, the numerous business facilitation measures that followed. Thank you again. As we emerge from the pandemic, we met with geopolitical tensions that are impacting us all. We are a net importer, far remote from most of our markets, we are facing high inflationary pressures and major logistic issues. Our country's labor force is shrinking. Upskilling our local talent is key, but the private sector must be able to recruit internationally, and that in all of our pillars. In an environment of demographic shift, building a truly sustainable economy is a challenge. Business Mauritius is active on many fronts, laying the foundation of a future economy. And I wanted this afternoon to give you a few examples. On energy transition, Business Mauritius drafted a memorandum inviting the authorities to agree on a plan to reduce our share of fossil fuel energies down to 55% by 2026. We are for a smarter and a more open economy. This will in turn impact real estate development and enhance networking opportunities to the benefit of all. We have commissioned a report on this matter for clear recommendations. A growth coordinator on inclusive development has been appointed for a concrete implementation plan. Business Mauritius has built a network of more than 30 champions that are leading these initiatives. Business Pulse surveys will allow us to monitor how business adapt to the post-pandemic world. We will thus adopt an evidence-based approach in our discussions with government. A gender balance initial report will enable us to start the shaping of an action plan. I truly believe that our businesses have a lot to gain in women empowerment. A procurement platform is being upgraded, and this should help SMEs. It is our hope that this program will help reduce our import dependency in the longer term. As a country, we face many challenges. Over the last 2 years, we've been in a high fiscal environment that is putting us at a competitive disadvantage. We will need a pension reform, and that includes CSG, that is sustainable, bearable for the next generations. Our attractiveness in many of our pillars ought to be reassessed. A new vision be brought forward for faster economic growth. Now, coming back to the subject of a good tango. Although not an easy path, I am nonetheless encouraged by the progress made. The recent meeting with high-level decision makers in government demonstrate the willingness of both parties to move forward in the right direction. We have strong hope that through such regular meeting, we will be able to address the important issues we are facing. At the highest level of government, we appear to be aligned for a collaborative effort on the following subjects: how to further open our economy and boost its investment attractiveness, how to give a new momentum to the financial services sector now that we are compliant, provide the appropriate environment for the expansion of the pharmaceutical and healthcare sector, and finally, ensure the transformation of our energy sector. I do hope that a sense of urgency will prevail and that we will tackle all these issues fast. Under the aegis of the Economic Commission, 4 subcommittees have been set up to make clear recommendations to government. I take this opportunity to thank the chairpersons of the commissions and all those involved. Your contribution is indeed very precious. Dear members, we showed determination in the face of a severe socio-economic crisis. As a result, the traditional and emerging sectors are recovering from the multiple shocks we have experienced. We are bound, unfortunately, to have many more challenges due to the current tensions, and we will have to be ready for that. Much remains to be done, but we are nonetheless starting to reap the fruits of our teamwork. I would like to thank each of the associations present today and that also sit on the council members and the vice chairman for their invaluable support throughout the year. Special thanks to the team of Business Mauritius under the leadership of Kevin for doing an incredible job on the ground. very often discreet, but so impactful. Let us keep on the excellent work and continue to grow for a better Mauritius. Thank you for your attention.
Merci, Monsieur le Président, pour votre message bien appuyé et aussi pour avoir présidé la première partie de l'Assemblée générale. J'invite maintenant le directeur général, Monsieur Kevin Ramkelawan, de nous éclairer davantage sur nos activités. Kevin donnera aussi le ton pour le panel discussion par la suite. Merci, Kevin.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, friends, all protocols observed. Really at the outset, a big thanks to Jean-Pierre, to our president, and to Anil, our vice president, because really over the year, they've given their time and their commitment to drive the business community's dialogue with the government. It's really been a long, arduous task, and thank you so much for this from the bottom of our heart. And also, the dialogue with the business associations. We are here today together, but there's a lot of work that happens behind the scenes, and I think the Council and the President and Vice President have been instrumental. So thank you for your trust, and thank you also for the BM team for your professionalism at each and every point in time, and for your dedication. There's no work hours, and I love the fact that we all are able to work together. And I think after 5 years now, almost 5 years, soon 5 years, at the head of Business Mauritius, I really believe that we can do more together. We are together, we have the power to change things and to do a lot more. So today it's not really a short address, it's a really short address. I think the President has given you the tone on what we are doing and what we are going to do. Obviously we're here to discuss more as need be. But I really like to give you our perspective, because we sit in a very interesting place where we can see the different sectors, we can work with different policymakers on different subjects. So I wanted to take this time, to take your valuable time, perhaps to tell you how we see ourselves as the business community in terms of economic situation, and how we see the future a little bit I must say. So it's true that where we are today, and we're looking at 2022 calendar, so we look to December 2022, it is quite clear, and I think this is quite unambiguous, that there will be recovery. We can discuss about how much recovery, but it will be a strong recovery. Whether it's 6-7%, at the end of the day, that's not meaningful, but the trend of recovery for this year is clearly there in the major sectors of the economy. There are some caveats. Construction, I see Shirley there. Construction is taking some time to pick up, particularly the local constructors, but there are work that we do with Basic as a partner member to try to find solutions. Retail and SMEs are also a little bit lagging, but retail and SMEs will pick up, and retail, I see Yusuf there, and Amita will pick up as the economy picks up. So there is no necessarily direct policy measures, but up to December, I think we will see a recovery. But this recovery comes with a lot of uncertainty and a lot of challenges, and we can't underplay that. The challenge is external. It's really beyond our control. Our key markets are either in recession or cutting down their growth forecasts. I'm thinking of the UK, I'm thinking of South Africa, but also France and Germany. And Germany is extremely affected by the Ukraine conflict. So those, and I see Jocelyn there, Germany is the outlier right now in terms of what is of the tourist markets. So all those key markets are extremely important for us, and we need to watch out and monitor. But there's not much we can really do there, apart from watching out. On the balance of trade, the visible trade, the estimated deficit is growing. We see exports increasing in dollar terms, which is very useful and very interesting, but the deficit, the X minus the M, is continuing to increase because costs of produce, of products, of intermediate goods continue to increase. And that also affects the balance of payment. We see an increase in the deficit this year. I think the current projections are around 21 billion rupees for the end of the year. This is actually quite high. And in fact, at the end of the day, in this end of year until December 2022, in fact, the interesting thing to follow is the consumer sentiment. And I'm not sure the consumer sentiment is there right now, and that we can see people spending that much for the moment. At the level of Business Mauritius, and I think the President has explained it really well, what are the key things on which we are working. But to summarize, not to summarize, but particularly to give some focus and some highlight on 4 areas where we think we need to co-construct with government, but also co-construct amongst ourselves, amongst the business community. The first one is on financial services. And when we think of financial services, I see Daniel there, I see Vashish. We kind of sometimes think, yes, it's the export area of financial services. But there's a lot to be looked at, and particularly with regards to the credit rating of Mauritius. The international credit rating, we are now at the last rung of investment grade. And to be able to go back to reverse the trend, there are a lot of systemic things we will need to work together. But the dialogue is there. Now we have to work on it. Energy, I think the President also talked a lot about it. We've worked significantly on energy. I see Jacqueline there. Jacqueline is still young and fresh, but I think a lot of energy has gone on this biomass framework. So we are working together, but beyond biomass, and I see Olivier and the team there, a lot of our members in the energy sector, there is a lot to be done. And energy has an impact, not just as an investment area, but in the view of resilience. As we move forward, I'll talk a little bit about it in a minute, but resilience and energy are linked. If we can produce our own energy, at least part of it, we become more resilient to external shocks, because that is the catcher, in fact. The cat is out of the bag. Healthcare pharma probably serves 2 purposes. One, it's a sector where there's a lot of investment potential. There's a lot of value proposition for Mauritius. Let's not forget all the COVID vaccines were done with the Mauritian macaques. Let's not forget by end of next year, most major airlines will forbid the traveling of live animals for testing purposes. And in fact, rather than this being an issue, it becomes an opportunity. China has closed its boundaries. If you want to do testing, you must go to China. Mauritius has an enormous opportunity, and linked to that, the healthcare and pharma area has an enormous amount of growth. So as we look forward in terms of growth and also in terms of resilience, because unfortunately COVID is not the last pandemic to hit us, there will be more. We know it today. We know as we globalize, our risks are huge. We know that, for example, just yesterday, Tanzania has had an outbreak of Ebola. So this is extremely important. And finally, and for us, it's probably not finally, but assembles the whole thing together, is opening up of Mauritius to talents, opening up of Mauritius to investors. Let's not forget we have the unique propositions there. We are, whatever we may think, we are a lifestyle destination, and we have the agreements with Asia. We have on your building on the agreements with Africa. Yusuf and his team work a lot on the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement. The opportunities are huge, and Mauritius can attract, but there are things we need to do to simplify, to make it simpler, make it better. But whilst we do that, we must think of the solidarity levy. We cannot, for some rupees of taxation, jeopardize this possibility that we have to bring talents and investors to Mauritius. So this is something we need to continue co-constructing, in my view. But beyond that, this is within our ambit, and these are things that we can do and we can work on. But there are long-term issues which require patient investment. Philippe is hiding a little behind, but he's the one driving it for us as the chairman of our Commission on Sustainable Inclusive Growth. Climate change. Climate change is, whatever we say, is the long-term issue, and we have to be able to be resilient to climate change. Today and just recently, I was on a panel with the DFIs, with international donors, and where we are taught a lesson today is, yes, this is how much the public should invest, this is how much the private should invest. But the real dialogue is that we as a SIDS have contributed to 0.01 of the carbon footprints in this world, yet Mauritius is the 9th most vulnerable country in the world. So there is some form of arbitration and some form of readjustments that need to be done there. But climate change should be on our minds, all of us. With that, sustainability climate change in a way, I generalize it, but sustainability cannot come without inclusiveness. We know that. We try to be sustainable in a bubble. Next door, if we are not inclusive, our neighbor changes. We've seen it in India. The COVID pandemic has hit so badly in India because that inclusiveness component perhaps was not as clearly there. And today, and I'm very excited at Business Mauritius because as we talked about inclusiveness, we do already a lot. We have an inclusiveness developer who goes and meets all of you to tell you why you should follow our inclusive development guidelines. Sanjana is somewhere there, with Harold, of course, being the one whose brainchild it has been. But as we do that, with Philippe, we are trying to think of the next step of inclusiveness. And that's actually moving from inclusiveness to communities and creating vibrant communities. And once we create vibrant communities, we will be much, much more resilient because then we're talking about local, we're talking about our neighbor being part of our own supply chains. And there's such exciting things to happen. And of course, that brings us even closer to our idea of being a lifestyle place. People who come to Mauritius look for authenticity, look for communities, and really the work we are doing on there is very exciting. We're talking about geographies, but we're also talking about thematics. So more about that maybe as we move forward. But as we do that, as we talk about sustainability and inclusiveness, we must realize as the business community that there will be an increasing number of shocks at a higher frequency. This is also known. So not much we can do about it. It's not us who are creating it, but we will have to live it, and we will have to find way to rise and to ride above that wave. And that comes from resilience. And we need to have more resilience as a country, but also as the business community. There's a last one, which, I hear many things, but I don't really know how we can deal with it, perhaps apart from opening up. It's demography. We are all becoming older, and as a population, we're becoming older. As a world, we're becoming older. So opening up is one, and someone this morning told me we need to get incentives to get more people to have babies in this country. So that's perhaps beyond Business Mauritius ambit, but it is an issue. Demography remains an issue. We need people. We need people to work. We need people to drive. So there are some things on which we can act, some of the things where we can monitor because we can't act on it. But today, there is one particular subject out of this which I think really necessitates a deep diving, and that's inflation. We all think we know what inflation is. We do. We do know theoretically what it is. Inflation has been managed in the past, but I think that today and in this current context, we are in front of what I'm calling the inflation quagmire. Why is that? Because let's just quickly say something. Let's just quickly say that in August, right now, the headline inflation is 8.8. Headline is obviously more balanced because it looks at averages over 12 months. It's 8.8 year on year, so today compared to the last August is 11.5. Both 8.8 is the one we need to follow. Headline is the one we need to follow, really, is really high. 8.8 is high. In the Economic Commission, led by Gilbert Yanni, we actually know that this inflation will go up. We believe September the inflation will hit a new peak, but then it will fall slowly. It will fall a little bit, probably by end of the year. By the end of the year, it will fall a little bit, but it will still be around, hovering around 10%, probably just under 10%. That trend of high inflation, we only knew, last time we heard of it was in 2006, 2008, where at its peak inflation was around 9.7%. But it was short term, it was linked to very specific things, and it was quickly managed. It was short-lived. So it didn't stay in our mind that much. We knew that for a year or two we fought in compensation, we saw a bit of fall in our standard of living, and then we caught up. But the real issue of inflation, where it really affected Mauritius and affected the world, was in the 70s and 80s with the oil shocks. And those were indelible for those who were there at the time. I wasn't there. I was there when I was a child. But obviously, as all of us who've trained as economists, those were key areas that we studied. And high inflation and constant high inflation is extremely complicated for businesses. It's complicated because you can't manage anything. You can't manage your supply chain, you can't manage wages, the pressures come from anywhere. We know what it means, we know what inflation means. It's too much money chasing too few goods. But in our current context, it's very different for Mauritius because our inflation is imported. Our inflation is not because the prices are rising for X reasons, it's because the costs of production, the costs of imports are rising. And that is extremely difficult. It's a different situation altogether, and it requires real discussion to be able to at least work on the contours of what we should be doing. Now, conventional monetary theory tells you that when they, sorry, it's a little bit technical, but just bear with me for 1 second. Monetary policy really means looking at interest rates. So conventional monetary policy means when inflation rises, you increase the inflation rate, you increase the interest rate, and there's a rebalancing. MPC this morning, I think, met and probably the announcement that there will be an increase in interest rates in Mauritius. Now, unfortunately, we have a huge excess liquidity anyway, so there was not, increasing interest rates will not actually be the method to curb inflation directly. But if we don't do it, if we leave inflation too low, so if we leave our interest rates too low compared to the dollar or the euro, then you have a flight of capital. So the investors that invest in Mauritian rupees would go and invest in dollars. And what does that mean? Is there's additional pressure on your rupee, therefore there's depreciation of your rupee, and therefore your inflation, your imported inflation grows even further. So what do? FX on one side, inflation on the other side. But if we increase the interest rates too high, then we dampen that recovery we're all talking about. And if it's pushed too far, it actually stops the recovery. And then we are really stuck. Then all my caveats for growth to 2022, we will need to review. The effect on the entrants we've talked about, and we've seen it on local production and ultimately on consumer prices. The consumer sees increase in things he's been buying for forever, and says, oh, it's the producers, it's our members from AMM who are our local producers. But they know there's our members from AMM that their prices are rising because their cost of entrants have been rising so much. So there is that element, and of course the issue on the visible trade is clearly there. Now the second big area is the effect on wages. Obviously, salary compensation exercise is about correcting for loss in purchasing power. And we all agree we need to compensate that loss in purchasing power. But whilst we do that, we do realize that additional money in the system will actually continue increasing inflation. And this is called a wage-led inflation, and this has killed economies, the Latin American economies, particularly in the past. So we will need to be able to find balances there. And this is really the question. And this is why we wanted to have this panel today, because we are one voice. But if we get the right people around the table, some from the policy angle, some from the consumer academia angle, and some from the private sector angle, we would be able to find a certain balance. We don't have the one from the private sector, so Pierre Dinant, unfortunately, is not too well today, but he's given me his points for the questions that I wanted to ask him, and I will take it at the end of our panel. But to give us the policy angle and to give us a bit of academia, but I'm hoping more on the consumer side, and I would like to invite the remaining two panelists to join me. The first one is Mr. Sen Narayanan. Sen, if you could please join us here. And the second one is Professor Sunil Bandhu from the University of Mauritius. Please join us, and a big hand for both of them. Very quickly, and I'll also join you guys, if you don't mind. Perhaps a short note on our two panelists. I'm sure Sen needs no introduction, but still, I think just for the record, let's introduce him. Sen is a senior economic advisor at the Ministry of Finance, Economic Planning and Development. He has expertise in monetary economics and development economics. He's been working at the University of Manitoba in Canada for a long time before returning to Mauritius. More particularly, Sen is a member of the MPC, of the Monetary Policy Committee of the Bank of Mauritius, and he's also a member of the chief economists of the African group of the World Bank. So someone who has a lot of experience, and I hope will be able to give us some insights on the policy angle on dealing with the current inflation we have. With us, we have also Sunil Bandhu. Professor Bandhu is Associate Professor in the Department of Economics and Statistics at the University of Mauritius. He has published a lot, but he's particularly in the areas of trade and financial liberalization, pro-poor macroeconomics, and competition policy, amongst others. Many other things he's done. He's also been a consultant working for projects with the World Bank, with the Africa Economic Research Consortium, and in fact, he has for a long time been attached with the IMF Institute of the IMF. So we have someone who can help us on the policy side of, I'm hoping, more of an academic area of this discussion. So welcome, Sen. Welcome, Sunil. We are delighted to have you with us. Thank you for being here. I would really like to perhaps start with Sen on a generic perspective. You know, perhaps if you could help us understand how, to what extent is the conventional monetary policy able to deal with this imported inflation? How do you see this interplay between monetary policy, interest rate inflation, and exchange rates? And then how do you see inflation progressing till the end of the year and perhaps for next year, if you can have some perspective? The floor is yours, Sen.
Okay, thank you, and good afternoon to you all. It's working? Yeah, it's working. Well, there are three questions, actually. Okay. And so I'll try to start with the first one, which is conventional monetary policy. Well, it's obvious that most of the inflation we are experiencing now is imported. I say most of it because when we look at the headline, it follows very closely. It follows very closely the world inflation rate. And it has been doing so for the past 10, 15 years, which means that over the years, we've been able to manage inflation locally, domestically produced inflation quite well. But we have not been able to really have a grip on world inflation rate. But fortunately for us, the world inflation rate has been also quite low for many years. But when it goes up like this, we obviously suffer quite a bit. Now, why do we suffer so much from imported inflation? It's because 85% of our energy needs are imported. About 77% of our food are imported, whether it's for seeds, fertilizers, and so on. So the inputs into growing food locally are also imported. Plus, we are so dependent on manufactured goods also that we import. Now, can monetary policy address that? It can. Okay, conventional monetary policy can, because there is an element of demand in it, and monetary policy is a demand management tool. But when we address it through increases in interest rates, if we reduce demand, because we have supply shocks, so if we reduce demand, we can attenuate the impact of inflation. But the problem is when we do so, we can drive the economy into a recession. So we have a trade-off to make, okay? Now, inflation is probably more dangerous than recessions, okay? It's more difficult to deal with because it can create a dynamic of its own. And we know some countries are suffering from 800% inflation, 1,000% inflation, and so on and so forth, because they didn't get a grip on inflation. So it's important at the very start, okay, to be able to make that trade-off, to know exactly where, okay, to what level we can raise interest rates without driving the economy into a recession, okay? It can be done. It doesn't necessarily mean that the economy will have to go into a recession, but we have to know what kind of space we have to play with the interest rate. If we don't get that right, there's a risk that we'll go there. And probably we are seeing already around the world that many countries are going to go into what we call a stagflation. Now, Kevin, you're too young to remember, but I'm not. Actually, I started my studies in the 70s, and we had a lot of thinking going on among the economists, okay, on how to deal with that situation. In those years, there were actually recession and inflation. So it was much worse than stagflation. It was called recessflation, okay, recession and inflation at the same time. So we don't want to get into that situation again. That's why I think most central banks around the world, okay, make sure that they raise interest rate now, they fight inflation, and then they will deal with recession, okay? There's no way out. A trade-off has to be made. Now in Mauritius, the situation is very different because we are a country that has always been chasing higher growth. Okay? We've been doing that for the past 50 years, and we've been successful somehow, but there have been a cost. Okay? You've talked about sustainability and inclusiveness. We've been having growth, but at the cost of forgetting, okay, or putting less weight on inclusiveness and sustainability that we should have. Probably if we did put more weight on inclusiveness and sustainability, growth would have been lower, but more inclusive and more sustainable. Now, can we, in such a situation as we have now, keep with that growth rush mentality? Okay? Do we need to grow by 5%, 6%? Do we need to achieve that? And I'm not talking about the recovery. The recovery, of course, will be higher than 5%. But once we get to normal, okay, should we be happy with 3% to 3.5% growth? Okay? We have to make a choice, because otherwise, higher growth than that, and we know we have constraints, lots of constraints to deal with, and the labor market constraints. We have productivity constraints, and so on and so forth. So if we push for higher growth and higher growth, we will create a situation where our development will be done, but it will be quite inflationary. And that is dangerous. Okay? So how do we kind of ride out this crisis, inflation, and prevent it from becoming a crisis? Now it's a shock. We have to deal with it. How do we prevent it from becoming a crisis? Okay? Now, in the 70s and 80s, when I was studying economics, there were new theories. Okay? And of course, in those days, there was the famous Phillips curve. Most of, okay, I'm going to get a bit technical. It's my academic side that's taking over now. But in those days, we had to review the theories. And there were economists who were actually reviewing the theories and came up with the right solution, like Milton Friedman and so on. But nowadays, we don't see that happening. Nowadays, we see firefighting all over the world. I mean, for many years, monetary policy in the world has not been effective. Quantitative easing in Europe has been a failure. So I don't know, okay, what that means for the future if we have another crisis that, or another inflation that will develop it into a crisis. I don't know what the theory is. Now, second part of your question is?
Your projections.
Projection for, the inflation is going to be here to stay for, the inflation rate might go down, but the price level will stay quite high. I think when we look at what's happening around the world, there's no indication that supply, okay, the trend that we're seeing in supply now will suddenly change and improve. So I think it might get worse. And so if supply, on the supply side, things get worse, it's not only the inflation that will be a problem. I mean, even if people can afford to buy, you may not find, okay, the supply on the market. So when you don't find that, what happens, you know, black markets and so on kind of develop and prices go up and the actual inflation is probably going to be higher than the official rate of inflation. And there will be a lot of redistribution impact on the economy where people with low purchasing power will suffer quite a bit. So I think we have we need to get solutions for all of that.
Merci. Thank you very much, Sen. This is the first round, and I'd like to just turn to Sunil now. Sunil, you've worked a lot on trade and financial liberalization, and really what I'd like to bring your views on would be on the consumer side, on the consumer prices side. We understand the effect of inflation on local production, inputs, and ultimately on the consumer prices. We understand the issue, therefore, between consumer prices and wages. What are your views? How do you see it with your competencies?
First, I would like to say thank you for giving me the opportunity to be.
No, it's working. Just closer.
To be in your midst to share my views on inflation, which is very topical these days, and we see it when we go to a supermarket, when we go to a restaurant. So we're already seeing the effects of inflation. So obviously, as Sen has just said, that we import a lot of food stuff. Then in the short term, there's not much that we can do because of the pandemic. We've seen also in a way how our economy is still exposed to a lot of shocks. And now we have a war in Ukraine. So with the supply shocks and demand staying the same and competition for the limited supply, obviously the prices will go up. And given that we rely so heavily on imports, we are hard hit by the imported inflation. So we have a cost of production going up. Just recently I was watching a program on Canal where they are showing that even the grains, how the suppliers having difficulty of exporting it. And we know what is happening in Pakistan. And in India also we know what they're going to do, what they've already done with export duty on rice. So obviously, given that we rely so heavily on imports, the consumer will be affected. Consumers will be affected, all categories. Of course, the poor will be affected the most, and also the VAT will also increase because of inflation. When prices go up, your VAT also goes up. So, and in fact, last time I was thinking about it, I was thinking, what if we didn't come with that minimum wage? What would have been the situation without this minimum wage for many people at the bottom of the ladder? And in the short term, and many of these commodities, if you look at it, they are price inelastic. And in the short term, we can, like government is trying to do now, try to diversify the source of supply, but there's a limit you can do that. Also in the short term, we can try to, like many Mauritians are doing, shifting to maybe what we might call other brands we are not used to, like what STC is trying to do, like we also do in our shopping behavior, trying to adjust our shopping habits. But when we look at a large majority of these commodities, there's not much we can do with imported inflation. And also, what I see from what I've seen is that in that push for inflation going up because of cost is going up in other countries because of supply shocks, adverse supply shocks, demand staying the same, and then the depreciation of the rupee. But also you have the oligopoly situations. So you also have in it also some type of market power inflation coming inside there. Okay, so it's imported. You got cost push, imported, wage cost push, supply cost push, and also you got some imported inflation as well. If you look at the freight costs, how it's been going up. So we are, and as my colleague has said, it looks like this is a new. We have dealt with it in the past, but the situation was different. It looks like the inflationary situation will be with us for some time. So we need to try to monitor demand. We need prudential interest management. Here also we've got to be careful. If you raise interest rate too much, you increase the borrowing costs, then you stifle the private sector and you kill jobs. You make it worse than before. So you've got to be careful. It's a very fine line. So you need these policies to be well coordinated, the government working with the private sector, and also our multilateral and bilateral relations, and also the fact that we need to consolidate the existing sectors and diversify more into the other sectors, the emerging sectors we've been talking about. Fortunately, tourism is picking up again, but we must still be careful there because of some shocks of probable recession in some of the main markets, in Europe, in Germany, as has been mentioned, and also, as we've seen, the world economy might be contracting. So when we take on board all these, so it's very important. We are at a juncture. In fact, I see Mauritius at a juncture. If we don't diversify, if we don't consolidate now, if we don't increase production in other emerging sectors, and if we don't increase our competitiveness, we are going to suffer more. We've got to consolidate our existing sectors, that's for sure, but as part of the SIDS countries, we know that we're exposed to shocks. What we have, inflation is what we call a systematic risk. There's not much you can do to diversify it away. It's a systematic risk. So, and for me, what I see is that we need to dovetail policies very carefully. We need our bilateral relationships, our multilateral relationships also to make them work better. Our only insulation, in a way, to try to protect ourselves against inflation, maybe, I won't go against what Sen has said. We've got to have a prudent expansion, I agree. But the only caution I see is to diversify our economy, to increase production in the other emerging sectors. For me, in the short to medium term, we've got to do this. Otherwise, we are stuck. If we don't do that, we are going to keep complaining about high inflation, loss of purchasing power. We need to increase the the GDP. We need to increase the GDP. We need to build our other sectors. We need to increase production and competitiveness. Because in the short term, it doesn't seem that the inflation will peter off so easily. As we said, projecting to be around below 10% or around 10% at the end of the year. Next year has been projected to be around 6%. But we've got to be careful because we look at headline inflation, which is very important, very correct. With headline inflation, you have a fuel and food and commodity prices, which are very volatile. And if you look at the situation, if you look at the world economic outlook, it doesn't seem that this volatility is going to disappear so soon. And Senna said about the supply lag. It takes time to increase the supply. So the supply lag will be there for a few years. And with this volatility in energy and food prices, so we've got to cope with that inflation for some time.
So no, I think we all agree. I think both, the only area of non-convergence is whether growth should be limited or whether growth should be expanded and diversified. But I think we can live with that dichotomy for the moment. I'm taking some time on behalf of Pierre Dinant, who, although he was not here, actually sent me his response. And I thought it needed to be said so we can balance. So Pierre is talking from the private sector point of view. Pierre believes that imported inflation cannot be really solved by monetary policy, but recognizes that if we don't act on monetary policy, we will have the depreciation issue, and hence, at the end of the day, there will be inflationary effect on all imported materials and services. Agrees with you, Sen, that it is very much an evolution worldwide, as you said, and points out that it will be a very lengthy process to eliminate such disruptions. So there will be disruption risks across the world, and before the world eliminates it, it's going to take a lot of time. So a little bit what you're saying, inflation is here to, what both of you are saying, inflation is here to stay for a long time. So Pierre believes that the shift towards local production, I'm looking at AMM here, is extremely important in our strategy going forward, and that we need to work together in appropriate policies. We believe that the appropriate policies, of course, Jacqueline, you two, ça va sans dire, but that the policies are probably not necessarily there to promote such shift towards local production. So that requires to be worked on. But he brings a new two areas in the discussion that I haven't heard first. I haven't heard here for the moment. One is that consumers today in Mauritius are very vocal about the consequences of inflation on their monthly budget. And therefore, that is an issue that will have to be looked at and resolved. A little bit of what you're saying, but I think the importance of that we need to look at. But he clearly makes the point that if monetary policy can only barely redress the situation, the real game changer is in productivity. And I think this is what he's bringing to the table here. We have not been talking about productivity, but it's true. Productivity in Mauritius is falling. We can look at labor and say it's growing. We can look at capital and say it's not doing that great. But in fact, what we should look at is multi-factor productivity. And we are abysmal. I mean, I think we need to face it as a country. We don't know how to embed technology, not individual groups. I'm sure you all do very well individually, but as a country, we don't embed technology in our processes sufficiently to have multi-factor productivity increase at par with what other countries are doing. And that is a very important issue. And Namita, I know that MCCI works on technology transfer. I think maybe this is something where we will need to look at a little bit more. I'll just quickly complete. Pierre is I love what he says. It's an impossible task of squaring the circle, trying to manage inflation and recovery. And I think he also says that in the 80s, Mauritius took a very wise decision, and it applied almost to the letter the expert recommendations of the IMF and of the World Bank. There was some very serious restructuring exercise that went there. I don't know, maybe as a final comment, I will ask Sen to comment on it. But Pierre is also talking about the youth of Mauritius and the time bomb, that is the population time bomb that exists in Mauritius. And in fact, this brings me, whilst concluding what Pierre has said, I would just like to bounce off a few things that have come up and give each one of you a few minutes to respond so that we're able to secure this section, and then I will move to a final question on salary compensation. So we keep salary compensation for second and last round. But Sen, I hear what you're saying, that we need to deal with inflation first, and then we can deal with recession after. I think this is very wise, because in many ways this is what is happening in the developed economies. Maybe to understand whether we have the tools and we have the ability to implement this here. You've talked about also growth and growth on both sides. I mean, particularly to Sen on this one, if we have a 3.5% growth, we've just completed the first round of a talent retention and talent attractiveness survey. And we see that one of the things that gets the youth to go is they have more opportunities to grow faster elsewhere. So if we limit our growth, aren't we in fact condemning our country to live with a demographic issue? It's a real question. And I'd like to ask you those two questions, and I'll follow up with something for you.
Well, okay, maybe I should explain what I mean by the growth rush. Because there's been so much emphasis on growth that we've done very well on the economy. As I said, not enough on inclusiveness, and today we are paying the price for not having done enough on inclusiveness, because lots of people, more than 50% of the population don't feel, okay, they have benefited from the growth we've seen in the past 30, 40 years, okay? So, if we don't balance that, what will happen socially? Okay, even sustainability. Okay, I'm glad that I think we're all thinking the same way, that there has to be a balanced growth between a balanced development involving growth, inclusiveness, and sustainability. These have to be integrated. We cannot talk about economic growth without talking about inclusiveness. Now, let me tell you one thing that you probably know. When we were talking about Mauritius becoming a high-income economy, okay, back in 2014, in a budget, we said that Mauritius will be a high-income economy by 2020. Nobody paid attention to that. And even some politicians later told me that, you know, we cannot talk about high-income economy to people because they were saying, okay, what's in it for me? You know? And when we became a high-income economy, we really did not celebrate. It's true we were in COVID, but we should have celebrated by becoming a high-income economy. When Singapore became a high-income economy, Lee Kuan Yew wrote a book, From First World to Third World, from Third World to First World. Okay? That was a big celebration but we did not. It's like nothing happened. Okay? And it will take us maybe 4 or 5 years before we get back to that. But it's something to celebrate, but we cannot because we're not inclusive enough. So 5% growth for the past 50 years on average have been good, but not inclusive enough. Now, the other thing is, not many countries have been able to sustain more than 5% growth for more than 5 decades. Okay? Very few, maybe only 4 or 5 countries. Now, Mauritius is close to that. But when I look at the kind of constraints we have, you know, shrinking labor market, labor force, okay? Skills mismatch on the labor market that has existed for about 20 years. You know? How in a country can a skills mismatch exist for 20 years? Okay? some policies must be very wrong, or people are not responding, or we don't understand the problem. Okay? Why people don't want to have higher skills so that they can make higher income?
True.
Why? So when I look at all that, there are constraints. Plus, we want development by bringing people to work in Mauritius. Fine. We will have growth, but not inclusiveness. Okay? And I'm not sure they are coming here because they want to develop our country. Okay? They're coming here for other reasons. In the process, they will develop. So this is why I say, if we go beyond 3 to 3.5%, we will put a lot of pressure on our resources. Okay? Already we've been talking about multi-factor productivity. For example, when I look at the use of land in Mauritius, the productivity of land, okay? We use more than 40% of our land to produce less than 3% of our GDP. This is a big issue. If we want to increase productivity, not only labor productivity, but land productivity, we have to make better use out of land. So there are major policy changes, major reforms, okay, to be done for in the use of our resources. So I think we need to be happy with 3 to 3.5% growth. Why? Because even when we were getting 5%, the population growth was probably around 2%. So the per capita growth was actually 3%, which was probably lower than today. Okay?
I get you.
So in terms of per capita, we are growing at a very good rate, at 3 to 3.5%. Not many countries can get that.
Thank you, Sen. In fact, the key things, and I think we can live with this as the business community, is that growth, more than live with it, I think we are going to live by it. Growth must be sustainable and inclusive. And I think this is what we are saying as the business community. So we very well rejoin you. And obviously figures, numbers, it's a figment. So we hear you. You think that it should be at around 3.5. Well taken, well noted. I'll pass quickly to you, Sunil. When we're talking about very squarely now, we are in a year where inflation will run around 10%. You were talking about minimum wage earlier, and you were talking about inelastic prices, and obviously there is some inelasticity and loss of purchasing power. At the same time, you mentioned something which I think is worth mentioning, is that there have been some profiteering by international dominant players during this crisis, and I'm thinking of the freight companies, the shipping lines and the freight companies. There have been abnormal profits in there. Unfortunately, we didn't invest in their shares early on enough. But I want to, if you can tell us, we will have a reality, which is by December we will need to talk about salary compensation. I'd just like to have your views on this. The minimum wage, inelastic prices, salary compensation, don't forget the inflationary push that comes with it, and the fact that we need to remain competitive because this country, these people export to make money.
Yes, so this is a very delicate issue about the salary compensation. We have a SCOLA, as we know, so cost of living adjustment. So, and we have unions in Mauritius. They are, I would say, fairly strong in their bargaining. When we are bargaining for compensation for the increase in prices, but generally, I would say that the wage increase has been lagging behind inflation increase. And obviously, the unions are going to push for maximum compensation for the workers, but we've got to be careful. We've got to be careful. We are walking on a fine line. So if you push too much a compensation, you kill the company. More workers are unemployed. So we've got to be careful. We've got to take into account the difficult context. Whether the unions will see it in that way, that's something else. I can't speak for them. So And for many years, in fact, Sen has been saying skills mismatch for 20 years. And we've been talking about more than 10 years about that increases in salary should be matched by productivity increase. We've been talking this for more than 1 decade, I guess, much more. So it's very important that in these tripartite negotiations that we act responsibly, we see the international situation, but at the same time, we see what's happening to the prices locally. So it's as Pierre said, it's a difficult task to
Squaring a circle. Yeah. Squaring a circle, he says.
It's going to be difficult, and at the end of the day, the government will have to decide.
It's a tripartite, and thank you for this. I think you have given us a good point of view. Obviously, it's very delicate, and no one is going to bind you by this, but I think you're saying we must think of productivity when we think of this salary compensation exercise, and that productivity needs to be linked to measures for reducing skills mismatch and increasing value addition per labor. Thank you very much. The fear of losing everyone, because I think it's a very technical discussion, and maybe a few people might not be that interested, but I think they all are. I've been following. No one is too much on their phones. Last word for Sen, and then last word for Sunil.
Well, okay. Back to inflation.
Okay.
There's a lot of emphasis on effect of inflation on consumers, on businesses, and so on. Okay, so it's fair enough. I mean, that's what inflation is about. That's why we have to care about inflation. But you know, for many years, I've been very worried about other inflation. Consumer inflation just tells you about one aspect of inflation. Consumer prices, the CPI, okay? And it can tell you about the trend that inflation is going to take. But I've been more worried about asset price inflation in Mauritius. That has been, a major problem in our economy, and it can constitute, going forward, a big problem, big issues. Because what happens, for example, if when interest rates have been so low for so many years all around the world, what happened, people move into physical assets, real estate, okay, other types of assets. And there have been huge asset price inflation. Today, an average income couple may not be able to buy land and a house because the price of land and houses they've been excluded. Okay, so we've been having exclusive development. We've been forgetting totally about the other aspects of inflation that have been, bothering people, putting, middle income, they're just middle income by name. When you look at the impact of inflation, or the kind of expenditure they need to send 2-3 people to university, 2-3 children to university, and so on and so forth, it has become impossible because prices have been going up so much. And now it has become even more difficult to send children studying abroad because of depreciation and so on. So we have to look at exchange rate policy as well. But again, even if we stick to inflation, we have to address all aspects of inflation, not only consumer prices. That tells you only, one part of the story. The biggest problem affecting Mauritius right now is the price of housing for the middle income. Okay.
Thank you very much. I think this is very pertinent, that we need to look beyond CPI, and maybe for the other types of inflation, we don't need monetary policy. We can find other ways of dealing with it. So thank you so much.
Yeah.
Sorry, did you want to say something, please?
No, I wanted monetary policy can do it. No, it can take into consideration, because monetary policy precisely has been doing the same mistake. It has not been looking at the other aspects of inflation, because when it decides on whether to raise interest rate or not, or do conventional or unconventional policies, it has to take all these other aspects into consideration too.
True. Sunil, last word?
Yes, so, I didn't want to, I'll just say that we have to look at the nature of inflation. And the nature of it, short term, is what we are seeing. It's imported. It's imported inflation. Now, I tend to agree with Sen, and this has been an IMF recent report, projecting growth to about 3 to 3.5%. We need to be cautious not to too fast on growth, and this can make the inflation situation worse. But we must also be careful, because we've got to look at the nature of inflation, as I said, which is important. Now, given, I would say, the volatility of energy prices, food prices, and we are still far away from being dependent on our own energy sources. I think Sen said we depend on 85% on imported, food about 70%. So if we look at the nature of inflation, we see it's important. There's not much we can do on that front. We can diversify supply to a limited extent. The supply lag will be there, as we said. Changing our consumption habits, this is something very difficult. And we can shift to some lower quality brands or some cheaper brands. But these are palliatives. So when I look at it, for me, the answer is macroeconomics. It's macroeconomic management. We've got to get our fundamentals. We've got to get our economy moving forward. That's why I still believe that to be able to navigate through this, which we see will be there for at least a few years or even more, we need to have a prudential growth. We need to have it. Otherwise, we'll be stuck. Otherwise, I see we'll be stuck. So we need that in a way, as we see, we have a labor constraints. If you look at, I understand that the Business Mauritius is doing a study on brain drain, which is about to come out soon.
Talent retention.
Yeah. So if you look at the brain drain index for Mauritius, it's quite high. So we need to restore confidence in the Mauritius economy. We need to restore confidence in the rupee. Recently, the rupee has depreciated a lot, but very recently we've seen a rebound. We look at the rates, we see it has appreciated against the euro. Yeah, the pound has gone down a lot. So, and we must create a demand we must create a confidence in the economy. We must create the confidence for the business sector to invest and for the foreign investment to come in. Of course, we have a labor constraints. We'll need imported labor, we like it or not. We can't do otherwise. So we have to bear this all in mind. And my conclusion would be that we've got to, one, think that it's imported inflation. My conclusion, my part of the answer to it would be this prudent macroeconomic management to further develop the economy. If we I'm sorry, I'm digressing. I'm taking more time.
It's your last
Even if you look at the import substitution, it has worked for some items. One item where we need to get more is about growing our own vegetables and so on. But even import substitution has met with limited success in Mauritius. We have to admit that. So our drivers of growth have been mainly export-led, and as we know now also the financial sector. So
Sunil, we hear you. We hear you very much, diversification.
I'll stop here.
And we can have, I think there's such interesting debate, there's a lot of things to be said, but we hear you on this. I think Sen wants a last word, a really last word before I conclude.
Not because I want the last word, but I forgot to actually say my last word. No, I think talking about solutions going forward, okay? In the short term, we don't have many solutions. We have only monetary and fiscal policy and some structural policy. But in the long term, the solution is import substitution. Because most of our inflation for the past 20 years have been imported. And so the solution must be on imports. How do we do import substitution? Import substitution means we produce more of what we consume. Energy is one of them. We have everything we need. And you know, you yourself, you've come up with a paper. We have everything we need in Mauritius to produce our own energy. Absolutely. It's just a question of doing it, okay? We can produce more of our food, okay, be less dependent, and other things. But import substitution is not only about food and energy and manufactured goods. We also have import substitution to do in the labor market. We're importing a lot of labor. 4 billion rupees are going out of the country because we import labor. And yet, our women participation rate is only about 46%. Okay, our youth unemployment rate is about 20%. So we have a lot of slack in terms of labor in the market. So why don't we also think about import substitution in the labor market as well?
It's a very good point, Sen. Very good point. I would like just very, very quickly to conclude on what we've learned. I think there's a lot to be discussed and there's a lot of further analysis that maybe we should take at the level of Business Mauritius. But right now, this panel, I think, after all these discussions, I would like just to raise a couple of things that have come out. Is that our discussion on salary compensation must be linked to productivity, and it must address skills mismatch, and in fact, it must look at what you've just said, labor import substitution. There is a whole set of work to be done there, as well as letting the country open to get to be able to diversify. First point was on labor. Second point was looking at inflation beyond CPI, beyond consumer, to assets, and to also things like studying for kids, which are very true, and we see it already in our first talent retention survey. People are leaving because they think their kids will have better access to education if they migrate. Thirdly, we've talked about local production and the changing of habits. This is import substitution in the classical way as we know it. But fourthly, and I like what you said, Sunil, is we have to understand how to evolve. Whilst we need to import, substitute, and do local production, we can't be closed as an economy. We can't do the Japan mistake. So there has to be an understanding of where the fish are biting and how to move forward. And that is not contradictory to what you're saying at all. So I think those are real take-homes. So thank you very much. I'd like you to give a big hand of applause to our panelists. Sunil, thank you so much for having come. Sam, thank you so much. And Pierre, although he's not with us, has been formidable. And because you have been, as an audience, so receptive to technical jargon, which is very rare, so you also deserve a big hand of applause. Thank you. Thank you very much. Pradeep, the floor is yours to conclude.
So thank you, panelists. Thank you, Kevin. We survived this graveyard session. And if we leave these gentlemen for the next 3 hours, they will continue the discussion. You can continue to speak. So, ladies and gentlemen, we are nearing the end of our function today. Thank you very much for your presence over here, for your support. So it will be nice to have you among us for the networking and a few refreshments. Thank you once again. Thank you.